Welcome back. When we think about World War II, the big images usually jump to mind, right? Normandy, Stalingrad, huge battles, massive armies clashing. We often focus on the hardware, the strategies. But today, we're looking at a different kind of battlefield, maybe a battlefield of ideas. Because between 1943 and 46, something really remarkable happened right here in the U.S. Over 371,000 German POWs, soldiers from Hitler's army, were held captive. And the story isn't just about containment, it's about transformation.
That's exactly right. And the sources we've looked at are pretty clear on this. America managed something its weapons couldn't fully achieve on their own. It actually defeated Nazism in the minds of many of these captives. And how? Mostly through, well, humanity and just showing how a free society, even under stress, actually functions.
Turning enemies into eventually believers in democracy and peace. It sounds almost too simple.
Well, the process wasn't simple, but the core idea was powerful. Most left convinced that freedom, even messy freedom, was better than totalitarianism.
Okay, let's unpack this. What sources are we digging into for this really fascinating topic? What do these guys expect when they landed here?
Right, well, they'd been fed a steady diet of propaganda. They expected America to be, frankly, a mess. Decadent, weak, riddled with racial chaos, capitalism collapsing. Many of the first arrivals, particularly from the Afrika Korps captured in 43, had never seen the U.S. Their image was pure Third Reich narrative.
So they pictured slums, basically.
Yeah.
Broken streets, economic failure.
Exactly. They expected visible proof that the Nazi system was superior and America was doomed.
And instead, they get the New York skyline.
Precisely. Imagine that shock. Instead of decay, they see this vibrant, almost overflowing energy. Skyscrapers, busy ports, lights that never went out, even during a massive global war. It completely contradicted everything they'd been told.
That initial visual must have been a huge psychological blow. You're defeated, captured, and the enemy homeland looks strong, thriving even.
It was profound. And it wasn't just the cities. It was the sheer scale of American life and industry that hit them. Remember, they were taught Germany was the peak of industrial might and organization.
So what specifically shattered that myth?
There's one detail the sources highlight again and again, a kind of psychological earthquake, as one put it. It was the American industrial output, specifically war production. They learned, for instance, that Ford's Willow Run plant near Detroit was rolling out a new B-24 Liberator bomber, get this, every 63 minutes.
Every 63 minutes.
Yeah,
Wow.
just think about that. An unstoppable machine for soldiers told they represented the superior system, witnessing that kind of democratic industrial power. It was undeniable.
That single fact must have done more damage to their faith in the Reich than maybe even battlefield losses. It showed their system couldn't compete.
It directly attacked the core Nazi promise: efficiency, order, superiority. Seeing America's seemingly endless resources, its ability to just produce, it planted that first crucial seed of doubt. The foundation started to crack right there.
Okay, so after that initial shock, they're moved inland. Over 500 camps across the country, Alabama, Minnesota, everywhere. What was life like inside?
Well, this is where the next layer comes in. The U.S. made a critical decision: follow the 1929 Geneva Convention to the letter. That meant proper food, clothing, medical care. Crucially, it also meant they were paid for labor about 80 cents a day.
80 cents a day. So this wasn't punitive slave labor. It was structured work.
Exactly. And this adherence to law, to a formal convention, was itself a lesson. It demonstrated a system based on rules, not arbitrary power.
But managing nearly 400,000 men, many of whom were still ideologically committed Nazis, couldn't have been easy. How do they handle the internal dynamics?
That's a really important point. The sources mention something often called compound segregation. The U.S. Army actively worked to identify and separate the hardline Nazis, the real fanatics, SS members, U-boat crews who tried to enforce Nazi discipline, sometimes brutally, inside the camps.
So they broke up the internal intimidation structure.
Precisely. By removing those elements, they created a safer space for the majority, the ordinary soldiers, the Lancer, to actually think and question without fearing their own comrades.
That makes sense. They allowed doubt to actually surface.
It showed them structure and order could come from rules and rights from the Geneva Convention, not just from fear of the Gestapo or party enforcers, respect for a system, not just raw authority.
And the labor itself became a point of contact, right? They weren't just digging ditches.
No, far from it. They filled crucial labor shortages, especially in agriculture. picking fruit, harvesting crops, even building local infrastructure. They worked alongside Americans.
And that created connections.
It absolutely did. There's that famous quote from an Iowa farmer, "Those German boys saved our harvest." It shows how practical needs could bridge the gap.
And the sources mention something quite touching that years later, some former POWs actually came back to visit those farms, not as prisoners, but as guests.
Yes, imagine that journey. From enemy combatant to laborer to, decades later, a friend visiting the family farm. It speaks volumes about the human connections formed.
So, okay, that sets the stage. They're treated fairly under law, they're working, connecting. But you said there wasn't any forced re-education, no mandatory democracy lectures.
No, that's key. The change came much more subtly. It was primarily observational. What they saw was the lesson.
What kinds of things were they seeing that challenged their Nazi worldview so directly?
Well, several things. First, just the basic fairness for many guards, being treated like soldiers who surrendered, not like Untermenschen. Second, the social landscape, even inside the camps. They saw black soldiers and white soldiers working in the same U.S. Army. Now, we know America had deep segregation issues outside the camps, but even seeing any level of racial cooperation was, like, unthinkable from their perspective.
That must have caused some serious cognitive dissonance, though, seeing that relative integration inside the wire while knowing about Jim Crow outside.
Absolutely. The sources acknowledge that complexity. America wasn't perfect, far from it. But the argument is that even America's imperfect freedom, its messiness, was still a world away from the absolute rigid control of Nazism. They also saw women in roles they'd never imagined, driving trucks, running businesses. They saw Americans openly arguing about politics, criticizing the government in newspapers, and nothing happened to them.
Right. Disagreement wasn't treason.
Exactly. For men raised to believe dissent meant death or a concentration camp, seeing this noisy, argumentative, yet functioning society was, well, it was confusing, then intriguing, then maybe even admirable.
The U.S. didn't have to pretend to be perfect, just had to be different.
Precisely. The contrast was the teacher. And eventually, that curiosity led many to want to learn more formally.
So the educational programs were voluntary.
Completely voluntary. But thousands signed up. The Army facilitated correspondence courses, English, history, even philosophy. They set up libraries. And crucially, they got access to American newspapers and magazines. POWs started translating articles, running camp newspapers where they debated current events. They read the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights.
For the first time, likely, encountering the actual foundational texts of the democracy they were told was weak and decadent.
They realized the enemy nation had codified rights and freedoms that Nazism only pretended to offer. It was learning by discovery, not indoctrination.
Which brings us to maybe the most powerful element, and it feels almost counterintuitive in a war context.
Yes.
Simple kindness.
Yes. This seems to be the factor that cut deepest, according to many accounts. Forget the official policies for a moment. Think about ordinary Americans.
In small towns near the camps, people weren't always hostile.
No. Sources describe civilians interacting with POW work details, sometimes sharing food, inviting them to church on Sundays, sending small gifts to the camps at Christmas, chocolate, socks, letters.
Things that seemed small, but in that context.
They were huge. Remember, the Nazi system thrived on dehumanization of the enemy, but also of its own people, treating them as cogs in the state machine. When an American family showed simple human decency to a German POW, it wasn't just kindness. It was a validation of his individual humanity, something the Third Reich had systematically stripped away.
We have that quote, right, from a former POW.
Yes, it's incredibly powerful, he said. They treated us like human beings. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a tool of the state. I felt like a person.
Wow. I felt like a person. That says everything. It's the antithesis of totalitarianism right there.
It really is. That basic respect, that recognition of shared humanity, it became the sharpest weapon against the Nazi ideology they carried. Kindness disarmed them in a way billets couldn't.
So, as repatriation started around 1945, this transformation was becoming evident.
Very much so. Camp records, diaries, letters home, they show growing disillusionment with Hitler, intense discussions about Germany's future, about democracy. There's another quote. "We came here believing in conquest. We leave believing in cooperation."
And statistically, the program was incredibly effective at just keeping them contained even.
Astonishingly so. The escape rate was tiny, something like 0.6%. Many POWs admitted feeling safer in an American camp than they would have facing the chaos and retribution in Nazi Germany's final days.
Connect this to the bigger picture then, the long-term impact. Did this experience actually shape post-war Germany?
Significantly, these weren't just men returning home. Many were men returning with a new perspective, a lived experience of democratic principles, however flawed they saw them in practice. They became active participants in rebuilding West Germany. And some reached prominent positions. The standout example is Walter Hallstein. He was a POW here.
Hosting. He became a major figure in Europe.
The first president of the European Economic Community commissioned the precursor to the EU. A man who learned about cooperation, arguably while a captive in Mississippi, goes on to help build the framework for modern European unity.
That's incredible. It really brings the story full circle.
It does, and American intelligence at the time recognized what had happened. Their conclusion was blunt. The camps have produced more Democrats than any propaganda leaflet could ever achieve.
A quiet victory, then. One not with overwhelming force, but with decency, fairness, and the example of a different way of life. So these men took home ideas about law, opportunity, tolerance learned through experience, not lectures.
Exactly. The knowledge stuck because it was lived. It wasn't abstract theory. It was seeing something work, feeling treated like a human being. And maybe that leads us to the final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. This whole episode demonstrates a kind of victory achieved by being democratic, not by imposing democracy. So what does it really tell us about the nature, maybe the inherent strength of democracy? That it doesn't necessarily need to shout, to indoctrinate, or even to be perfect, that maybe, just maybe, consistently demonstrating its core values, rule of law, basic human dignity, is enough, over time, to win over even its staunchest enemies.